Welcome to the Gnostic Warrior podcast, where we explore the hidden aspects of human nature, consciousness, and the spiritual and paranormal realms of everyday life. I'm your host, Mo, and I want to thank you for listening to my show. Thanks for being on the show, Dr. Bruce Chilton. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm very well.
Before we get into the great work you're doing now in your books on Judaism and Christianity, can you please tell the audience a little bit about your background and who you are?
Oh, of course. I'd be happy to. I was born on Long Island in New York and educated there. I first went to college in the place where I teach now, Bard College, but there was a long detour between studying here and then teaching. After I graduated, I went to New York City, where I did a Master of Divinity degree so that I could be ordained in the Episcopal Church, where I've served as a priest for 40 years now. And after my master's degree, I was lucky enough to receive a fellowship, which permitted me to study in England at Cambridge University, did my doctoral dissertation there, and enjoyed England very much indeed, and was lucky enough to get my first job there. So I taught at Sheffield University and was there for 9 years until I was called to an endowed chair at Yale University. And then while I was there, the possibility opened up of my returning to Bard College in order to teach here. And I've been doing that since 1987.
Great, and that's a great career. And where is Bard College located?
Bard is straight up the Hudson River from Manhattan, as the crow flies, about 75 miles.
Great. And you had mentioned, what religion are you a priest of?
Of the Episcopal Church, that is within the Anglican Communion. And in fact, I've served churches in the United States and also in England, and from time to time also in Germany and in France.
And today there's many different sects of Christianity, which many people, of course, know. You know, the biggest one, I believe, would be the Catholic Church. People have heard of the Protestant Church and, of course, the other different sects that go along with it. What do all the various religions, or should I say sects, have in common with one another? Let's first start with Christianity. What is the difference?
There is a very small degree of difference between the Episcopal Church and the Roman Catholic Church when it comes to matters of teaching. That is, our practices are quite similar. Within the Roman Catholic tradition, the service that they call the Mass, we call the Eucharist, but in fact we are as dedicated to it as Roman Catholics are to the Mass. We have other sacraments which are regularly practiced. The place where we disagree with the Roman Catholic Church, and have done since the 16th century, is that we don't regard the Bishop of Rome, as we call him, they call him the Pope, as being the true head of the Church. And therefore we have differing understandings of the right kind of governance of the Church.
And so with that belief, would you fall under being a Protestant? Because I believe that term means does it mean anti-pope?
Well, it comes down to mean that. That's exactly the case. And certainly when the Church of England, as it was originally called, was formed, it was seen very much as a part of the Protestant Reformation. The place where there's a certain qualification about that is that we have the same kind of emphasis upon the historic tradition of the Church that you'd find in Roman Catholicism. So very often, if we are visited, let us say, by a Baptist believer, that believer would probably find us a little bit too much like the Catholics for his or her taste. You know, many of these matters about denominations come down to a question of taste. There has been an increasing degree of cooperation among all the branches of Christianity, I'm happy to say. And in some cases, there's also been good progress made in recognizing each other as being authentic representatives of Jesus' teaching.
When did this come about, this common denominator where people are agreeing to get along and also acknowledge the differences, but at the same time respect them without persecuting one another? When did this start? Mainly after the Vatican II, or was this over the last 2 centuries with the advent of the United States of America?
I think it's come in bursts. There was unquestionably, after the Second Vatican Council, an increase of ecumenical activity. But then the Second Vatican Council was also responding to the great activity of the World Council of Churches after the Second World War. I think the horrors of the Second World War made believers, and indeed reflective people generally, very aware of what had to be resisted in the future, made them aware of how it is that we need to discover principles not only of mutual respect, but mutual engagement. And so Vatican II, I think, was really a part of that most recent phase of the ecumenical movement, and many of its foundations were laid during the 19th century, where, as a result of historical work on the way in which the ancient church was actually a place of great diversity, there was an increasing recognition that we ought to embrace that diversity in the modern period as well.
The ancient church, would this be before Judaism, or would this be prior to Christianity?
Yeah, this would be in the period just as Christianity arose, taking it from the time of Jesus himself until the time that the Emperor Constantine decided to tolerate Christianity in the 4th century. So really we're talking about the first 3 centuries of the church's existence, a time when they were heavily persecuted by the official programs of the Roman Empire and had to learn how to live with a great deal of diversity within their own midst.
So that the early Roman Empire, it wasn't just Jews being persecuted, it was also Christians.
Oh, it was primarily Christians.
Okay.
In this early stage, Judaism was recognized by the Roman Empire as being a legal religion. And that meant that Jews had the right not to have to worship the emperor, which was something that could be required of other subjects of the Roman Empire. Believers in Jesus were in trouble because although some of them were Jews and could therefore claim to be a legal religion, most of them were non-Jews, and therefore they had no legal standing to refuse to offer worship to the emperor. And that was the principal grounds on which the Christians were made martyrs, the attempt to force them to worship the emperor.
That's interesting. And these non-Jews would be considered Gentiles?
They were Gentiles, exactly. And they were known to be Gentiles inside the church. No one within the church said you had to keep all of the law of Moses in order to be a Christian. And therefore, you had Jews and Gentiles side by side from the earliest period. Now, as you might imagine, there were different adjustments made in different places to accommodate that reality, but everyone had to accept that the new movement had somehow transcended the boundaries of Judaism and was making inroads into the Gentile world.
Today, to be a Jew would basically be you're a member of a religion. It doesn't necessarily define race, but if we look back at ancient history at the Jews, they were a specific race at that time. And your opinion, who were these people and where did they spawn from?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, what you just said is exactly the way the Romans viewed them. Their name for Judaism was the religion of the Jews. And the reason that they decided to make the religion of the Jews legal was that during the time of the Roman Republic, prior to the empire, there had been a treaty between Rome and the new Maccabean rulers in Jerusalem. And because there had been a treaty, that also implied that there was a mutual recognition. And that recognition meant that in Roman law, Judaism needed to be tolerated. Even if there was local prejudice, toleration was the rule of law. Now, at the time that the Romans came to this recognition of Judaism, that is, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, they understood very well that the people they called the Jews were those who claimed descent from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Hebrew Bible, and who also claimed sovereignty over the land that they later called Israel. Now, the name Israel itself, first of all, designates a people, and then after that, the area of land that they dwelt in. But within the ancient period, you would refer to the Jews, which in its full form would be the Judeans, in the same way that you might refer to the Celts, who were also recognized people, or to the Persians, or to the Egyptians. They were simply seen as one of the populations of the earth with their own sovereign territory within their history.
And this sovereign territory, of course, was granted. They made a deal, the Roman elite, the Roman emperors, or they were incorporated into the Republic and given special citizen status where they were able to, A, bring their religion and practice it freely, and then number two, they weren't considered slaves and they didn't have to pay taxes literally to the Roman Republic at the time, and they would have been the only tribe, which would have been the Judeans, that were allowed to do that. Am I about right in what I'm saying here?
Yes, they had an extraordinary exemption from the usual requirement of having to acknowledge the gods of Rome, which basically also meant the emperor once the empire emerged. Now, these rights that they had acquired at the time when Rome was a republic got whittled down over time as Rome became an empire, because the tendency of an empire is always to remove civil liberty. So eventually the Jews lost home rule. They were actually governed by local appointed Roman rulers of one kind or another. And also the Roman military presence was built up because the Romans saw their primary military challenge coming from Persia. And for them, what was historically Israel was simply a buffer zone that they were using in order to protect themselves.
Would it also deal with commercial trade as well? I know there's a lot of history around the Cohens and the Cohenim Levites being in charge of the purple silk trade for a while. I don't know if you have any history of that. I know this isn't kind of related to the religion part, but I know it does play a part with them being granted special status.
Oh, yes, without question. And they had an enormous role to play within the economy of Jerusalem because the temple in Jerusalem was a major commercial center as well as a religious center, precisely because sacrifice of all kinds was going on there. And the place had become an enormous magnet, not only for pilgrims, but also actually for tourists. People would make their way to Jerusalem simply because it was a magnificent city with the largest temple that existed in the ancient world, and there they would do what pilgrims and tourists always do in such sites. That is, they would purchase with great enthusiasm, and that meant that the temple itself was a major center of trade within historic Israel.
How did the Levites play as far as a role in forming the church or forming the Christian religion? Would they be instrumental in doing that?
Some of them were at the margins, but the reason for which the establishment of the temple was formative for the emergence of Christianity was, for the most part, because they opposed the early Christian movement. When Jesus visited the temple in the last year of his life, he entered into a deep and, at the end of the day, violent dispute over the question of what the proper purpose of the temple was. Jesus himself was formed by the literature of the prophets of Israel. And those prophets make it very clear that the purpose of the temple should be for the offerings of God's people to God and for prayer, and that commerce should not be a part of the operation. Now you can see, given what we've just learned about the various trades that the priests had become engaged in, that he was on a collision course with the high priesthood, and particularly with the high priest of that time, whose name was Caiaphas. Caiaphas had centralized offerings in the temple so that people, when they went in to sacrifice, would actually purchase their offerings, their animals, their grain, their wine for sacrifice, inside the large open court of this magnificent temple. When Jesus visited Jerusalem for the last time, he was appalled by what he saw there, and he re-entered that temple after a few days, having gathered sympathizers, and they cleared out those who were trading along with the animals in the large open court of the temple. This incident is typically called the cleansing of the temple, and I have made it a kind of modern campaign to oppose that language. The issue was not cleansing the temple, the issue was really occupying the temple. He was trying to take control so that those commercial operations would be completely expelled. This is actually what produced the crucifixion. Caiaphas responded by insisting that Jesus should be arrested, and Caiaphas denounced Jesus to the local Roman officer, who was Pontius Pilate, who then, being a loyal Roman, also had Jesus crucified, because from the Roman point of view, simply having good order within the temple was a priority. So at this very early stage, you had intense opposition between the priesthood on the one hand and Jesus on the other hand, and this opposition continued with the arrest of Peter and other apostles in Jerusalem, and much later, in the year 62, with the stoning at the order of another high priest named Ananus of James, who was the brother of Jesus. So all of those priests who were for the centralization of power within the high priestly hands of Caiaphas and his successors were opposed to Jesus and his movement. That was the reason for early persecution. But there were some people, particularly some Levites, who thought that Jesus was correct, that this prophetic vision of not having commerce in the temple was exactly what should be realized on the ground, with the result that there are among the early followers of Jesus people such as Barnabas, the apostle, who was also a Levite, and who likely saw the movement of Jesus as an opportunity to continue priestly offering, but to remove the commercial dimension from it and to get away from the very centralized hierarchical power of the high priest.
In your opinion, what were these priestly offerings for? And of course, later, what you had mentioned in the time of Jesus, the temple had turned into a place of commerce as well. Were these offerings strictly for the priests so they could basically eat and drink whenever they wanted? Or was there a specific spiritual, God-given purpose to sacrifice animals or whatever, or bring offerings to the temple? In your opinion, what was the reason for these offerings?
Sure. The reason for the offerings is really set out in great detail within the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible. And it was understood that really these sacrifices are on behalf of all of God's people. The basic conception was that when Israelites gathered within the temple, and they had taken care that they were clean, that is, that they were pure of any kind of defilement, and when they offered sacrifices that were also pure, not only were they enjoying them as a feast, but also the God of Israel was joining with them in that feast and taking pleasure in it with them. Now, there are various kinds of sacrifices. Some, for example, you offer at major times of the year, at Passover, at the feast called Shavuot, weeks, which is also Pentecost, and then also at Sukkot, which might be called Tabernacles. These were huge national events with very significant pilgrimage activity going on all over the Greco-Roman world. And these are proper feasts. That is, the people that go to the temple are not only giving something up, that modern understanding of sacrifice, where you give something up and get nothing in return. That's not the ancient version at all. Their understanding is they are offering to God, but they are also receiving back. In fact, they are eating rather better than they usually do during the ordinary course of the year. Now, there are some other sacrifices. For example, if you sacrifice specifically because you are righting your relationship to God after some wrongdoing on your part, if it's an offering for sin, then under those circumstances, the part of the offering that you ordinarily would receive back from the sacrifice would go to the priests. So there's something in your question. That is, the priests would, in fact, be getting more on average from these sacrifices than the people who were taking part in the ritual. This led to a certain resentment about the standard of living of some of the priests. And it is very interesting that if you read the Mishnah, which is a rabbinic collection of laws and regulations concerning all elements of the law, you will see that one of the problems that the high priestly families living in Jerusalem had to face was that they had difficulties with their hearts, and they suffered from gout in a way that other Israelites did not. Just what you would imagine from their much richer diet as compared to other people.
Can you tell us the purpose of religion? What is the main thread that they all have, the various different religions?
Yeah, I would say that each of them addresses three fields of human activity, and the characteristic of any religion is also that it relates these three fields of activity to one another. I don't see that any other facet of human society does it in the way that religion does. And these three facets are, we can begin with just what we were speaking about. The first is ritual. As far as I'm aware, all human societies have rituals such that there are certain patterns of behavior that anyone within that culture can join into and know his or her place and relate to others within that same ritual. And in addition to ritual activity, a religion is also a system that addresses the question of ethics. That is, it tells any person or any group what the expected or right behavior is, what their relations to others outside the religion ought to be, how it is that they would face major life events, what are the demands on you as someone who is a child, as someone who is going through puberty, as an adult, what happens as you age, what is the proper attitude you should have as you die. All of those ethical questions and more are also involved in any religion I know of. And then finally, a religion also develops an overall view of the meaning of all these activities. It tells the participants, this is the reason for which you engage in these rituals. This is why you have the ethical demands on you that you do. And this is going to be the course of your life. And if there's a belief in afterlife, then this also takes you into the next world. Wherever there's a religion, I always look at how they address those three areas, and then also how they relate to one another over time.
It's interesting when you give us the explanation, those three different things. It's basically an instruction book for life on how to live right.
I think that's right. I think it is pretty simple. And I think also this is why people who practice religion and theologians inevitably end up having arguments with philosophers, because philosophers think they do that. and they're right. They do that. There's no question about it. However, philosophers are kind of stuck in the meaning side, and they don't relate to the way in which how you think about meaning affects your ritual activity and your ethical activity. That's where religion, it seems to me, is a comprehensive way in which a people comes to think of itself, and why you need to understand it in order to understand how any culture operates.
It's interesting, if some of these philosophers truly studied the history of religion, the teachings, the various quotes from, all the church fathers, the saints, Jesus, and even the founders of the other religions, you would find that they were philosophers, essentially. That's what they were, but that they had taught their people how to live. It wasn't just about wisdom and dissecting wisdom. It was about life. It was about gnosis. And I look at them, even Jesus and a lot of these saints of the Catholic Church were, in a sense, they were Gnostics. Even though they persecuted the Gnostics, I look at them as an organized brotherhood that had decided to live under a certain code of ethics. Jesus was a philosopher. He was a Gnostic, but this is kind of what the religion of Christianity was based on. There's several quotes that I could pull out of the Bible that are literally, they're quotes on philosophy, on wisdom, they're quotes on Gnosticism, but, they're part of the Christian religion.
Oh, yes, I think that's exactly the case. And within the early period, let us say we lived during the second century of the Common Era, precisely when some of the most exquisite Gnostic literature was being produced. What we would see is that the people producing that literature were side by side by the groups we now call Orthodox Christian believers. And in fact, sometimes they belong to the same congregations. So the idea of the Gnostics being separate from the Christians is a relatively modern one. And increasingly, scholars of Gnosticism have tried to find other ways of speaking about the relationship among these differing movements.
They were all fighting and having various wars over one another, whether that be over differences in beliefs and teachings and so forth. Just, the story you had talked about, Jesus being crucified and his belief that the temple shouldn't have any commerce or money changers in it. And the high priest at the time said, no, you're going to screw up our business. You're going to cause disorder. You're going to be crucified because of that. So it seems like that there was this fighting between various Gnostic sects at the time, and we could say this was the Ophites. It could have been the Nicenes, the Essenes, and then you had the Romans who decided, it was in the 4th century, to, of course, organize it into Christianity, but that they had decided just basically to put an end to it all and just like, okay, if you speak out against these teachings or against the high priest, it's essentially a death sentence because it caused disorder. And then over time, they had various decrees and councils where they decided that, hey, this is what we're all going to agree upon. This is what all the various bishops and leaders have decided is truth. And anybody who speaks against this is going to cause disorder. And that's why they had persecuted these other people, because they were just constantly fighting one another. Would I be somewhat safe to say that, or am I right?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I'll give you another example of this. The people we call the barbarians the people that sacked Rome and that were at the gates of Hippo when St. Augustine died, they actually were Christians. They were people who believed in Jesus, but they didn't believe in the form of the Trinity, which in the 4th century and later came to become the law of the Roman Empire. So what happened when the Roman Empire first tolerated Christianity and then made Christianity into what amounted to the state religion is they did what they always did. That is, they would elevate some form of belief. And they would say, as the Emperor Constantine actually said, he said, just as there is one emperor and one empire, so there's got to be one church. You have this view that unity is absolutely essential. We cannot have divisions inside the empire in any idiom. So the great prosecutions of various heretics, including Gnostics, the growing persecution of Jews, came about as a result, actually, of the Roman Empire recognizing the Christian religion, because this is what occurs when a power decides that one religion is going to be on top within their hegemony, and when they take themselves the right to determine exactly what form that religion will take. This has been the typical pattern of religions for most of human history. And it was really only during the course of the 17th century and later that we came to the view that toleration was a possible state policy. And now, of course, it's emerged as an international principle that we ought to acknowledge toleration as being among the rights of human beings. And we can only hope that will go well.
It seems like it's a good thing until you fast forward to today and you see the rapid immorality of our current society without religion and God combined with the state. So I'm definitely for free thinking and people to have the right to choose what religion they would like to be a member of and follow without being killed for making that choice, or even to choose if they want to not to believe in any type of religion or God or read a Bible, and of course not be killed. But in the same breath, you could look around America today, we could look around a lot of the Western countries, and it seems that we are completely immoral and we're just going down a wrong way road to what looks like oblivion and destruction. It looks like Babylon, Sodom and Gomorrah. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there is a strain, especially in American thinking, that I have come to call secular Puritanism. That is, the one that says that questions of religious value and religious practice don't belong as part of public discourse. And of course, if that is what you do, the result is predictably that people are going to get the sense that it doesn't matter at all what they believe or what they don't believe. That, I think, is a deeply deceptive message to be giving people, especially to young people, when just at their time of life is when they are most inquisitive about these values. I've found it very interesting teaching not only here at Bard College, but in other institutions, that a typical attitude of some of my colleagues on the faculty is that, the study of religion really isn't part of the academic environment because we should be entirely secular. And my view is that secularism is itself a kind of religion. People are perfectly entitled to adhere to it, but then they have to define it, and they have to defend it along with all other forms of belief. And I think I might be a little more hopeful than you in the sense that I find an increasing curiosity among people studying in the institutions I'm familiar with an openness to the idea that the values that frame their lives are not just consumerism, not only their ambition for status and success, but they really do go beyond that towards intangibles which religions define better than most other systems.
It just gets a little frustrating, I think, on the street, here seeing the various people that condemn religion. I see that a lot because I run a blog called GnosticWarrior.com, and I actually write a lot about Gnosticism, but in the same breath, I write a lot about the various different religions because I believe there's a common thread amongst them all, and especially with Christianity. And every time I normally will write about that, there'll be some person, whether they're into Gnosticism, they think that it has no purpose or anything. Religion shouldn't even be brought up in the course of teaching, about these various, this history and stuff. So it just gets a little frustrating from those people out there that just knock religion all the time and think it's just to control people completely. What can you say to those people out there that maybe condemn religion and think it's just a way for people to be controlled?
Well, thank you for the observation. It is certainly an accurate one from within my own experience. This is exactly the attitude I've talked about under the heading of secular Puritanism. And I think one remark that I've found helpful in the past has been to ask people who make that objection what exactly it is that they prefer as an alternative. Why is it they believe that academic work or public discourse should be free of religion? And then that discussion might well take us to just the issue you raised, namely that religions are designed for the purpose of controlling people. Well, you can only make that statement convincingly if you say it very quickly, in the sense that as a system of control, for the most part, religion doesn't work very well at all because, as I was saying earlier, religions do combine these three facets, ritual, meaning, and ethics, and therefore a change in any of those facets will lead to a change in all the others. And sometimes that occurs as a result of a popular sense of what is true, which is new compared to what existed earlier. For example, the Reformation, which transformed Europe during the 16th century, occurred in the way that it did because of a groundswell of opinion which called for changes in the regular rituals of the church. Of course, leaders such as Martin Luther were important in that, but they were only important because they could speak, not because they could command. And these ideas revolutionized the practice of Christianity, not only Protestant Christianity, but also Roman Catholicism, and eventually even Eastern Orthodoxy. So the fact is that religions, like countries, can function democratically. They don't need to be systems of control. And in any case, if we're concerned about systems of control, I would suggest that late capitalism is a much more effective method of that than is any religion. That, I think, is what presses people into the corner of constantly believing they don't have time to think about value. They can't be concerned about ultimate questions of meaning. They believe their lives are constrained by the necessity of economic survival. This is a kind of con. I mean, they are pressed into a position where they react in ways which are not true to themselves because they believe they have to do that. They're being compelled by the marketplace.
And when in fact they have free will, of course, we all need to make a living, but it doesn't mean negating the spiritual or not spending time, whether it be on rituals, on morals and so forth. So they kind of use that as almost their form of religion to discount any other religion or religiosity or spirituality. Would you say that'd be safe to say?
I would say that is the case. They use that as a way to press out any other consideration. I particularly noticed this because I've been living out of the United States for a number of years. And when I came back, it would sometimes happen, and still does from time to time, that I will say to someone in the ordinary course of things, "How are you?" And their response will come back, "Busy," which of course is not any answer at all, but, is a way of saying, I am not going to ask myself that question. I'm simply going to be concerned by the ways in which the world of commerce is defining me at this moment.
How would some of these people out there, because I know I have also suffered from this sickness, I believe, of being imbalanced between, the materiality of having to make a living, support my family, capitalism, paying the tax man and so forth, and then also balancing that with ritual, balancing that with spirituality, with my health, with everything that I believe religions are based on. We kind of throw out the window so we can go make the almighty dollar. In the long run, that defeats us. It makes us sick. It makes us unhappy because we're not fulfilling our soul with what it truly needs. And I believe that religion, whatever religion that might be, or religion you might be a member of out there, the people around the world, that helps those people. How can people find that balance again? Maybe they're just worried about the dollar. How can you help them find that spirituality again?
Yeah, I think the way to be helpful is to remind ourselves and remind others that work is important. It's just that work is not everything. And I, like you, have, sometimes worked too much, fallen victim to that temptation. And what I attempt to do is to see work as a part of ethics. It's not the whole of ethics by any means, and it's an important element within it. But then there are many, many other human relationships that we come into in the ethical field. And I think many of the choices we make about what kind of work we should devote ourselves to, how much we should commit ourselves to it, has to do with our other relationships in life at the same time. And then that's just the ethical part. And then we also have to ask, how does my work and how do my other ethical relationships relate to my own view of what the purpose of my life is, as that is expressed by various kinds of ritual activities, whatever they may be. So in other words, the influence of religion can be helpful in permitting a person to put in context any kind of element within his or her life. It might be work, it might be another personal difficulty, it might be the way in which they think about value. Religious systems all have resources that would permit a person to reflect on those realities. And no religious system demands from the beginning, you have to accept everything here in order to use any part of our treasure. You can use that treasure freely as it becomes available to you.
I know you're an expert on Judaism and Christianity and not so much Islam, but I know there's a lot of people out there that, they're questioning religion on its face based on what they're seeing in the East with this terror group called ISIS, who they're basically going around beheading people, shooting people, killing people if they don't accept Allah, or even raping young children and so forth. What is the purpose of this religion of Islam? Is this just some specific sect that went off the deep end, or what's your thoughts on this group?
That group, I think, in particular, is the result of the enormous disservice that was done to that region of the world, starting with the end of World War I. And really, it hasn't stopped. That is, at the end of World War I, with the Treaty of Versailles and later agreements, the entire area of the Middle East was divided up arbitrarily into countries. Many of these boundaries did not accord with the traditional lands of particular groups of people. And very often these regimes were seen as setting themselves up in opposition to Islam or not recognizing the principles of Islam. That was one major force. Another major force after the Second World War was the Second World War, inevitably, that saw an enormous amount of destruction in the area as a whole. And then finally, the oil boom put its own particular distortions on all of the fragile social structures in that area. The net result of that was that the practice of Islam within these areas didn't have anything like the sort of centralization within religions that we're familiar with in the West. That is, the various kinds of Christianity that we have, the various kinds of Judaism that we have, they all have recognized centers of authority that can speak for them, that are in consultation with one another. We started our conversation with a reflection on how the ecumenical movement has thrived in the West since the end of the Second World War. But now you have very small conclaves of Muslim practice. And sometimes these conclaves of practice are completely out of touch with the educated traditional forms of the religion. That is certainly the case in the instance of ISIS. And the result is truly, there's no question, you're right, dreadful behavior. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Abraham's Curse. And one of the purposes of that book was to show that what we are facing today in the case of jihadi violence, we have seen before in the case of the violence of Christian crusaders, and also in the case of the activities of some Jewish fighters during the time of the Maccabees. And many of them are using the same language and the same passages in the Bible in order to justify their behavior. In other words, whenever you see any social group put under the kind of pressure that we've seen exerted in the Middle East, you can predict that at least certain elements of it will react in this way. It doesn't in any way justify the behavior. I'm not doing that.
Sure.
But I am saying that we understand on the basis of historical precedent that the most effective way of neutralizing this kind of activity is to bring the practitioners within these groups back into touch with their roots within the religion. The religion itself is the solution. If you attempt to say, this jihadi violence is what Islam is, therefore we are at war with Islam, then I have to tell you you're going to lose. What you need to do is to make these groups aware of what Islam is, with all of its richness. And then you will see a modification over time, especially if you can bring about the kind of possibilities of development, ordinary human development, which have been denied to most people in this region since the end of the First World War.
Yeah, that's an interesting story in history that I've never heard in regards to the First World War with this all developing, but it makes perfect sense. I'm kind of usually stuck back, in ancient history, not looking back, 100 years or 50 years to see a lot of these changes, which a lot of them have happened over the last 100 years. And if we're to look at this group ISIS, who's sometimes called ISIL, it kind of reminds me of radicalized Christian groups that we could say, because not all these radicalized groups aren't just coming out of Islam. Of course, we had, Jim Jones, who was, I think, back in the 70s, where we had that incident where they all committed suicide, all of his followers. And then there was another one in Waco, Texas, and of course the conspiracy theorists want to talk about that. I don't want to get into to how they were killed eventually by federal authorities, but there was a shootout. But they would be considered kind of radicalized and an offshoot of Christianity, even though they were Christians. They didn't speak for the religion as a whole. They were just on their own in their own little radicalized sect. So this same thing, Jim Jones, Waco, Texas, can be said about the group known as ISIS. They're just a radicalized sect of Islam that do not speak on the whole of Islam.
Exactly so. And I would add to the list Timothy McVeigh and his
Correct.
association with the Christian militias in this country, which continue to exist, as they do also, and indeed increasingly in Europe, especially in recent years in Germany and Romania. And I would say the same thing of such groups, that what we need to do, as we do in relation to various kinds of separatist forms of fundamentalism, is to explain to these groups what Christianity in its history truly has been and how we can all learn from it. That, I think, will bring about a great deal more change than trying to confront them as if they really did represent the religions they claim to.
That makes perfect sense. And if we were to look back again at history, every single religion, it doesn't matter where it comes from, the various different denominations that have been birthed throughout history, they all have blood on their hands, where there is a past history that we're not happy about, that there was murders and atrocities committed by all religions. It doesn't matter which one it is in the world today. We have to learn from our past and not repeat those mistakes, which of course we try to do in the Western world here today, but also Islam also needs to do. So those people out there around the world that, are skeptical about religion and different things, every religion has made mistakes and has blood on their hands, but also they've done a lot of good. So we can't blame certain past events, whether that be the Catholic Church or the Protestants and so forth, fighting with one another, each one killing one another over their various religions, to today, to Islam. So I like how you say we got to teach them about the roots and the true history and not just the bad things that a lot of people like to focus on.
Yeah, that's right, because that gets us away from trying to find some mythic religion of peace that's never done any harm to anyone.
True.
Very often people with not too great an experience of history will claim that one religion or another is never violent. I mean, the idea, for example, is frequently encountered that Buddhists are never violent. Well, you should try to explain that to the Tamils in Sri Lanka, who were actually exterminated just a few years ago in the name of Buddhism. You get the idea that Hinduism is characterized by the teaching of Mahatma Gandhi. Would that it were. But the fact is that the Hindu riots against the Muslims in places like Ayodhya have been a formative part of modern India's history. So, as you say, each of these religions does have blood on its hands. A place to start is to get away from the kind of apologetics that says, my religion is peaceful, or mine, if you truly understand it, will never provoke violence. These, it seems to me, are evasions. I mean, just as it seems to me, if you're going to be a responsible American, you have to own to mistakes that have been made and violence that's been perpetrated. So if you're going to be a responsible believer, you have to see the things in your own tradition, which in the name of the whole religion, you need to correct and you need to be open about.
Common sense. That's really what it is in reasoning, because the same could be said about us individually. We have all made mistakes. We have all done things that we're not proud of and that might be considered unethical or immoral. And until we look in the mirror and recognize those mistakes, we can't learn from them. And then also we can't dwell on them, because we know if we're stuck in the past, always dwelling on these mistakes or these things we might have done, we can never evolve into the future. So it's common sense that if we're to do that as individuals and we're to grow and we're to become better human beings, that every religion, everybody could do this. So this group ISIS, they could possibly do that and morph and change. Again, I'm not being apologetic for them, but the same with the Catholic Church. They're not going around with the Inquisition anymore. Hey, take our Bible, become a Catholic, or be killed and burned at the stake. So it seems like everybody is evolving as far as the religions are concerned, but some people aren't evolving in regards to their thoughts about religion, where they might forgive themselves, but they won't forgive, some other group that might have made mistakes in the past, and their ancestors have to suffer for those mistakes. So it's just really comes down to common sense and reasoning, and not dwelling on these past mistakes, but learning from them.
I think that's exactly it, of reasoning closely, of understanding how other people react and why they react that way, and of seeing that just because another person has a certain belief, that doesn't mean that there's any pressure on you to accept the belief. You can understand long before you make any kind of judgment about what kind of belief is important to you.
And in the same breath, don't condemn them for some of the actions of the other people that might be of the same belief or religion.
That's exactly it. Permits them the space to live as well. Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about Jesus, the Messiah, and Christ. What does that really mean?
Well, the term itself, Mashiach, means someone who is anointed, quite simply. And within the Hebrew Bible, anointing had particular religious meanings depending on context. So, for example, the king of Israel might be anointed to that role, or a prophet could be designated as the successor to his teacher, also a prophet, or a priest might be designated in that way. So wherever the term Messiah is used within Judaic literature, and this includes early Christian literature, then you need to be sensitive to the context in which the language is being used.
Would Jesus be his given name, or was that a title that was given to him, just like Messiah and Christ?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Jesus is the name that he went by. It's the same as the name Joshua within the Hebrew Bible. It's simply the Aramaic form of that, and was a very common name.
And that was Yeshua?
Yeshua, okay. Exactly. And because it was very common, he also had to be described in some other way. So this is one reason for which he came to be known as Jesus of Nazareth when he was traveling in Galilee and in Judea. And the term anointed becomes applied to him because his disciples had wanted to know how they should understand his status in relation to God. And Jesus was very interesting about the term anointed, which is, again, is exactly the same term as Messiah, or in its Greek form as Christos, Christ. He said, if you want to know, understand that I am the anointed, but I don't want you to be saying this in public. And the reason that during his lifetime he didn't want the term Messiah thrown around is that some people did understand the term Messiah to mean that he, the Messiah, was going to lead a political insurrection. Jesus wanted no part of that, but he did think of himself as anointed by God in order to convey God's Spirit to other people. And after his death, during the period of his resurrection, the disciples understood that Jesus was with them again, raised from the dead, and that he, as Messiah, gave them the command to baptize people in the Holy Spirit. In other words, you had this idea that just as God's Spirit had been available to Jesus during the course of his life, so, as a result of his resurrection, that Spirit was now freely available to anyone who followed him. So, calling Jesus the Christ or the Messiah is a way of saying that through Jesus, the Spirit of God becomes available.
Yeah, so he, at the time when he was living, he didn't want to be called Messiah because some people had misunderstood that as, hey, you're here to save us, take us to the promised land, and that's not what he wanted to be conveyed to the other people.
Exactly. I mean, there were people who thought, let's find the Messiah, follow the Messiah, he will throw out the Romans, and we'll restore the kingdom of Israel again. I mean, there were people that thought that. I mean, there were major revolts that were launched against Rome, and later in the first century, after the death of Jesus, the Romans actually destroyed Jerusalem.
And that's why, because of that, right?
That was why. There was a revolution, and Rome was not in any way going to tolerate that. I mean, Judaism might be a legal religion, but it didn't cover rebellion.
And I also understand that they actually instituted a law that if any Israelites were to return, it was punishable by death. Is that any truth to that?
There is, yes, and that refers to, believe it or not, after the revolts of 66 to 70, there was another in 132 to 135. And that one was even worse. The reaction of the Romans more draconian. And it was then in 135 that they issued the edict that no Jew was to return to Jerusalem. That's right.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and I even read a story, I believe it was, I don't know, in the 5th or 6th century, there was a man named Moses, or he took in the name of Moses, and he had actually went back there and was going to try to part the Red Sea or some story like that and lead the people to the homeland. Did you ever hear about that story?
Yes, that's right. There were various prophets, that is, Josephus, the first century historian, calls them, for understandable reasons, false prophets, who said that they were the new Moses, they were the new Elijah, and they were not only in the first century, they continued. There have been sporadic messianic movements springing up from Judaism right the way through to our period. In fact, today, I mean, we were just talking earlier about a radical form of Islam. Today, there's a radical form of Judaism which adheres to the idea that they will build what's called the third temple in Jerusalem, and when they do so, the Messiah will come. Now, of course, to build the third temple on the Mount in Jerusalem, you have to destroy the Muslim Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. One reason for the growth of the movement called the Intifada in Jerusalem is the fear among many Muslim thinkers that the Jewish position in favor of the building of the third temple is going to result in their attempting to take over the Temple Mount.
Would this group be considered Zionist? Because you'll hear in the alternative research crowd that there's two different kinds of Jews. There's actually the traditional Jews, and there's the more modern Zionist. Is there any truth to that the Zionists are in part of that plan where they want to build that third temple?
It is in part, although it's certainly not all Zionists.
Okay.
That is, I would make a distinction between, I think what is being called attention to there is that at the time of the announcement of the State of Israel, there were actually in the United States, particularly in Brooklyn, Orthodox Jewish groups that were opposed to the State of Israel. And the reason for that, they still exist, is that according to the Talmud, it's not people who should establish the State of Israel. It's rather the Messiah that should do that. So there's no Messiah, therefore there's no question of a State of Israel. Now, Zionist opinion held to it that, in fact, it was possible to form a State of Israel. And indeed, many Zionists are also what are called secular Jews. That is, they view Israel simply as being a political entity comparable to others. Now, not all people who are in support of the State of Israel are Zionists. Typically, Zionists also expect that Jews living elsewhere will go to Israel. Perfectly possible to believe that there should be Jews in Israel and elsewhere. But then this third temple movement is different again. It is a very recent movement. It has really only come into prominence since the Six-Day War, and is another disturbing factor in and around Jerusalem, because it shows that extremist opinion has increased, and not only on the Muslim side. What's interesting about this is that there are many Christians who've come to support the Jewish Third Temple movement. These people are called Christian Zionists, but their motivation is completely different. They think that when this Third Temple is built, it will be destroyed, and then the Messiah will come.
What are your thoughts on this? Do you try, I know you report on this, of course you have a lot of knowledge on what's going on. You try to stay out of the politics side of the religions?
Well, what I attempt to show is exactly how these views emerged. It really goes back to what we were saying earlier on, that in the case of all of these expectations of what's going to happen in Jerusalem, these are not traditional Jewish or Christian expectations. They have only emerged in the relatively recent past. In the case of Third Temple Judaism, it's really only since the Six-Day War. In the case of what's called Christian Zionism, that has only been since the beginning of the 20th century. And in all of these cases, the politics is being mixed in by these groups. In other words, they are attempting to read their scriptures through the lens of their own political positions. That's one of the indications that a religious movement is beginning to lose touch with its own roots. And if we are able to educate those who are partisans of these movements, or those who might be attracted by them, to see exactly how this development has occurred, then I think we can address the problem.
In your opinion, what would happen if they did destroy the Dome of the Rock and built a third temple? What would be the result of that?
Oh, the result, I think, would be a true conflagration in the Mideast. Any attempt to do that, and in fact, an attempt was made in the early 80s. There was actually a plot uncovered by the Israeli police to blow up the top of the Temple Mount. Fortunately, it was stopped. The people concerned were jailed. But anything that would approach working in that regard would, I think, bring about an immediate response by surrounding nations. Because within the traditional understanding of Islam, the top of the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, is from where the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven and came back. So it is one of the holy sites of Islam, as well as being a holy site both of Judaism and Christianity. So for any one religion to claim Jerusalem to the exclusion of the others would be bound to bring about a very forceful result.
Which could be all-out World War III.
It could, because of the ways in which alliances are presently constructed, it could result in that. That's right.
Great. I just have a couple more questions before you go today, Dr. Chilton. You had once written "Experience is Everything," and a focus on perception was both the strength and the weakness of Dr. Huxley, Adolf Huxley's approach to religion. Can you explain what you mean by this? This was, I believe, a 2010 article you had written.
Yes, that's right. That was for The Guardian. They had asked me because Huxley's work was going through a fresh period of discussion. The reason for which I think it is both a strength and a weakness is that Aldous Huxley, we're talking about the period of the mid-20th century, is part of the revival of the idea that religion is not only a matter of what you believe. There had been a tendency by the beginning of the 20th century to see religion as being essentially dogmatic, so that the first thing you wanted to know from a given believer was his or her position on certain key matters that were held to be central within the faith. Some signs of this were the emergence of fundamentalism in the United States, the movement called Neo-Orthodoxy in Europe, headed by the work of Karl Barth. But Huxley was influenced by the work of a brilliant contributor whose name was Evelyn Underhill in a classic work called Mysticism. And in Mysticism, Evelyn Underhill had shown that the practice of religion, especially in the Middle Ages, but not only during that period, had to do with the way in which a person in prayer came into contact with the divine, had a sense of communication going back and forth. She showed that it wasn't simply a matter of repeating dogma or getting certain ideas straight. It really was a matter of experience. Huxley took this point of view, and he pressed it, in my opinion, too hard. That is, he saw experience as purely being a matter of an individual's awareness of God, apart from a tradition. And therefore, he also came to support the idea of taking, shall we say, chemical shortcuts in having an experience of God. And I think one of the ways in which that entire experiment has been shown to be wanting is that you can indeed change the doors of your perception by ingesting different kinds of materials. But that is not the same as developing this dialogue with the divine that Evelyn Underhill was talking about. So I see Huxley's importance as positive in showing how the work of Evelyn Underhill could be continued, but also cautionary in suggesting that we shouldn't simply be rushing to experience as if it were only our personal possession. Experience is also a part of the culture to which we belong, and we should be putting our emphasis on the establishment of a dialogue with the divine instead of simply looking for oh wow moments when we'll say that the divine is there.
If you had a chance to be a leader of a new religion, let's say the new universal religion, the new Catholic. I know Catholic means universal, and they said, Dr. Bruce Chilton, we would love for you to be a leader of this movement, but in order to do so, we're going to have to give up all the past religions and so forth, and we want to create one religion where we marry all the different faiths together, whatever we want to call it, and to stop fighting, and anybody else who's against it will not be allowed in this new world or this new religion. Would you say, hey, yeah, I would like to be a part of that, or would you want no part of it?
I'm afraid I'd have to decline. After all, this has been tried before, and what typically happens is that the new movement that claims to subsume all the others itself becomes a faction. This has been true in the case of Baha'i. It's been true in the case of Unitarian Universalism. I regard these as being completely good faith efforts to discover common ground among the religions of the world, but their outcome has been predictable. And I think that there is, in the light of our experience, always something potentially vicious in saying, we have discovered the universal code, therefore no other code is welcome. Part of living within respectful pluralism is to permit this variety to flourish. I think about religions in much the same way I think about there being different languages. I believe that we are all enriched the more they exist, and that the tendency of one to exclude the other is the one trait that we have to be careful of.
Well, that makes perfect sense, and I definitely admire that answer. And do you have any advice for people out there that would like to either become a priest themselves, like you are, or would like to become a religious scholar? What advice can you give to those people out there?
Well, today we have an enormous number of options in front of us, and I think it is possible in most cases within the United States to find resources to extend one's curiosity, to take up courses in religion. At the moment, one can do this not only in the settings of dedicated religious organizations, a seminary, but one can also do this at the level of colleges and universities, extension learning. All these give you possibilities of getting to the riches of these different traditions. And also the languages concerned are increasingly taught as compared to, say, 20 years ago. We are now coming out of a long, dry period in the study of religion, and we're now seeing it flourishing much more than anyone would have forecast a few decades ago.
Before we wrap up the show today, can you tell the audience where is the best place they could find your great work and your books?
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Sure.
I suppose I'm allowed to say Amazon, am I?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, that's a fine place to look at them. I think Barnes and Noble has also done it. I notice, actually, if you just search my name on the Internet, several of my works will pop up, and that will get you to various providers who could easily lead you to acquiring more.
Yeah, definitely. I Googled your name, and nothing but good can be found. There's definitely some great videos and lectures that you've also given on YouTube that I highly recommend that the audience check out. And I will put some Amazon links on the show page. So those people out there that would like to find those books, you can go to GnosticWarrior.com, and I'll have those links there. Bruce, it has been a great pleasure speaking with you today. I learned a lot about the history of Judaism and Christianity and religion in itself. I thank you for coming on the Gnostic Warrior.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Take care.
You too.